be it for me to put anybody on the spot, but today you need to know that the success of this sermon depends entirely on your participation over the next few minutes. No pressure, no pressure. Okay, a little bit of pressure. So this morning, what I want you to do, I'm looking for at least a few people to share with the congregation your hottest hot take. So what is a strong belief or opinion that you have, unpopular though it may be, that you are actually quite frankly surprised that more people aren't of a like mind about? What is that strong opinion or belief that you have that you're surprised isn't more prolific in the world around you? And for the sake of modeling vulnerability, I'm going to go first. I'll share my hot take. And I think I've actually shared this before, so maybe it's less a hot take and more of a pet peeve. But here's my thing. I believe it is wrong. I believe that it is morally reprehensible for somebody to use cash in a self-checkout line. Right? There are 15 people waiting to check out behind you, and you pull a wad of crumpled out ones out of your pocket, and then you have to smooth it out there on the gum rack as you try to feed them into that machine. There are people behind you with families that love them, people with lives, things to get to, and there you are trying to feed your crumpled up dollars into a machine. There are people at the store called cashiers whose job it is to deal with that mess. You need to go and see them. Right? So that is my hot take, and nothing less than Jesus Christ coming out of the clouds and descending in front of me over there at Stop and Shop and pulling a wad of fives out of his pocket and using it to pay at the self-checkout line is going to convince me otherwise. So that is my hot take. And while I still have the mic, I'll also mention that the Jonas Brothers, I like them. Their tunes are really catchy, and I know I'm like 30 years outside their target demographic, but I like them a lot. So just putting that out there as well. So what hot takes do you have that you're willing to share with the congregation? If you have one at home, put it in the chat box. Everyone would love to lift it up for Shelly. Her hand shot up. Oh, man. She's been waiting to get this off her chest. What do you got for us, Shelly?
Okay, mine is also Stop and Shop related. Okay, we live in Lexington, and I go to the one in Bedford because the price is a little better. But they have a whole row of cash registers, and they have the self-serve part. But whenever they open the whole row, they always open aisle 13. Only aisle 13. I've been going there for 10 years, and it's like, people aren't superstitious, but really, you come in, you're trying to get your shopping done, but you don't want to go to aisle 13. Why not 14 or 7 or 6 or 2? It's always 13. It's always 13, and it's just creepy. It's creepy, and I don't like going into the self-service. I always get the thing that can never find the grapes or whatever. And they always say, please put your package onto the belt. It's just so I wanted to get that off because it's weird. Just you have all these other choices. Why is it always aisle 13?
I got one up here.
Tell you what, after service, we're going to go over to Stop and Shop and bless it with holy water.
I got one up here.
What do you got?
Our digital deacon, Christy, says that it should be against the law to spit in public, that it's really gross, and it should just be outlawed.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's bold also because in today's story, if you heard, Jesus was spitting in public. So, I mean, okay, digital deacon Christy, that's a pretty bold statement. Does anyone, at least one more hot take? Kamal has one for us. Okay, man, get it off your chest. Let us know.
I decided to not do it about sports, but my biggest pet peeve over every other pet peeve is people who throw lit cigarettes out the window of their car while they're driving. I have literally tried to invent technology that would record this happening, and then they could get a fee for littering. But that's ridiculous. But nothing makes me more upset than anything. And it only gives me a little bit of pleasure to lay on the horn for a solid 120 seconds while I follow closely behind. But that's my biggest pet peeve in the world.
Thank you for that refreshing hot take, Kamal. Grace, yes, Grace, what do you got for us?
Okay. French fries are tasteless, gross, and trash that they make you pay for.
That is a hot take. Whoa, Grace. I don't know if you're making any friends today. Woo. Drew?
Pink Floyd is the most overrated band in human history.
Yeah, I feel Pink Floyd, overrated. Yeah. Oh, Pink Floyd is the most overrated band in history. I feel that on a very deep level, Drew. Anybody else? I mean, this is cathartic. All right, we're having catharsis here. So, if we get nothing else out of today's service, we really got to know each other, I think, a little bit this morning. I learned a lot about you, Grace. Tell you what. So this is what neuroscience tells us. Neuroscience tells us that when our hot takes like these, or when any strongly held opinion or belief is challenged, now be that challenged by the beliefs and opinions of other people, or be they challenged by hard facts and evidence, our brain responds to that challenge in the same way that it would respond to a physical threat. That is to say, that if your brain is hooked up to a computer, you got all those electrodes taped to a monitor, the parts of your brain that are stimulated when someone comes at you with a tire iron are the same parts that light up when your beliefs and opinions are challenged by other people. That's wild. That is really wild. But what that means is that when our hot takes, when our opinions, when our beliefs get challenged, our first instinct is never just to hear out the other side. Our first instinct is never to just deeply consider what they have to say. But rather, because of our biology, our first instinct is always to lock down and just further entrench ourselves in whatever position we're taking because we feel that we're under attack. And while you might not have known the neuroscience behind it, I think you all probably know this on an intuitive level because we see how this plays out every day of our lives. Right? So over the past few years, we certainly see it play out in the political arena. Right now in the United States, over 40% of our population is utterly convinced that the 2020 election was rigged and it was a result of massive voter fraud. And no amount of logic and no amount of evidence seems able to shake them out of that opinion, shake them out of that view. And when they are challenged, they just dig their heels in further and become further entrenched in that position. So we've seen it play out politically, absolutely, for sure. And in today's story, from the Gospel of John chapter 9, we get to see how that phenomenon plays out religiously. So last week, if you were here, you may recall that Jesus and his friends arrived in Jerusalem in order to celebrate the festival of the Tabernacles. This week, in this week's story, they are still there. It's a little later in the week. It's actually Saturday morning, and it is now the last day of that festival of the Tabernacles. As Jesus is walking down the street, he encounters a blind beggar on the side of the road. We're told that he was a man who was born blind. He's been blind from birth. And while I'm certainly hoping that he got consent from this man first, in truth, the story does not tell us, but what Jesus does is he spits in the dirt, he mixes it together, makes a little mud, and then he spreads it on the man's eyes. Now, us being the charitable sort, we of course want to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt, and we're probably saying to ourselves, I'm sure that was a cultural thing that people did. People were always making spit mud and rubbing it on each other. But it was not a thing at all. It would have had the same ick factor that you and I would experience if someone rubbed spit mud on our faces. Just so you know, it was not a thing. But when Jesus is done, he spreads this mud on the guy's eyes. He tells him to go wash it off in the pool of Siloam. For reference, the pool of Siloam was built in 800 BC by the good king Hezekiah. It's spring-fed. Originally, it was the water source that people would go to if they were residents of Jerusalem. But in Jesus' day, it was just a pool used for ritual cleansings. And it was actually unearthed. It was rediscovered just back in 2004. So if you go over to Jerusalem today, you can actually go and see the pool of Siloam. So the blind man goes to the pool of Siloam. He washes off his eyes, and miracle of miracles, he is able to see for the very first time in his life. When his neighbors get wind of this and they finally believe that it is actually him, they take the man to the Pharisees to get the Pharisees' read on this situation. The man reports to the Pharisees exactly what Jesus had done, and when he does that, these Pharisees are immediately up in arms. And the reason they are up in arms is that this whole miraculous event took place on a Saturday morning, which falls inside the Jewish Sabbath, which runs from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And during the Sabbath, it was prohibited on pain of death for any man, woman, child, or farm animal to do any sort of work whatsoever. And when I say work, I don't mean punching in for your shift at the factory, but I mean work very broadly defined. The rabbis of old went so far as to develop a list of 39 categories of work that were disallowed on the Sabbath. They were basically a list of actions that you just simply could not do, including, are you ready? Carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, I don't know why I'm using my fingers, I'm going to run out, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, or marking. So on the Sabbath, you were not to do any of that, anything that fell in those categories, anything that could be even vaguely considered work. And the reason the Pharisees are so upset by what Jesus had done is that his mixing of the spit into mud actually fell into one of those categories, and specifically the category of kneading, which is defined by the rabbis as mixing particles together with liquid. So Jesus very clearly violated the Sabbath commandment, the Sabbath prohibition against work, which was punishable by death. And yet, at the same time, plain as day, plain for anybody to see, the work that Jesus performed was miraculous. It was an irrefutably good thing. The man who had received his sight again, he puts it perfectly when he says, "Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it." So clearly, this thing that Jesus did was a good thing. Clearly, it was from God. And this guy who's only had his sight back for like 5 minutes, he could see that, but the Pharisees could not. But confronted with this truth, what did the Pharisees do? Well, they do exactly what neuroscience tells us they would do. They shut down, they lock down, and they further entrench themselves in their position. Their hot take is that Jesus is a no-good sinner, and dang it, they are going to stand by that assessment, come what may. Now, for the sake of intellectual honesty, I am obligated here to tell you that the classic reading of the story, and honestly, the reading of the story that John wants us to take away from it, is a reading that says that A, these Pharisees were a bunch of jerks and jabronis, B, they were completely wrong-headed, and C, they doubled down on all the wrong things. But thank God that we know who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. So we may double down on what we believe, but at least we'll be doubling down in favor of Jesus. And according to John in the classic reading of the text, that is a very, very good thing. So that is the classic understanding of this story. But what I want us to keep in mind about John, and I was realizing as I was thinking about the sermon this week, I should probably mention this the first week that we started this series, but when John was writing this gospel, Christianity was no longer just a fringe movement within Judaism. It was growing, it was expanding, it was quickly becoming its own thing. It was becoming its own religion. And in all honesty, things were getting to a breaking point, such that Christians were actually being expelled from the temple. They were no longer welcome there. And because Christians were being expelled from the temple like that, John, quite honestly, he has a chip on his shoulder whenever he is talking about the Jewish establishment or whenever he's talking about the Jewish devout. And that is not my opinion. That is established scholarly consensus that John did indeed have that bias. Because in all honesty, these Pharisees, they're not bad people. They're not powerful people. They're not people who are more corrupt than your average person is corrupt. In fact, they're part of this grassroots movement whose whole shtick was that they wanted to honor God by following a more stringent version of Judaism. So what they did is they actually went through the Old Testament and they just scoured it for all the rules and regulations that it contained. And when all was said and done, they pulled out from the Old Testament 613 rules and regulations, and they sought to live their lives by all of those. Each and every day, they sought to follow all 613 of those commandments. So, in other words, these are devout people who are just trying to do their best to honor God. And I, for one, have a hard time condemning them for that. But their failure in today's story, and in my humble opinion, is they simply weren't open to the possibility that God could work in a new way. They weren't open to the possibility that God could indeed do a new thing. And so when Jesus performed this undeniably good miracle, they experienced it as an affront to their beliefs. And they shut down. They doubled down. And they castigated Jesus as a sinner. But as the author and theologian C.S. Lewis reminds us, if you've ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, this is where he says it. He says, God is not a tame lion. God is not a tame lion. What he means by that is we can't predict how God is going to work in our lives or in the lives of other people or in the world more generally. We know from Jesus about God's character. We know that God is always going to move in loving and forgiving and generous and merciful ways. But beyond that, we don't know a whole heck of a lot. Because our perspective is like this, right? But God is like that. So our goal as followers of Jesus isn't just to double down on our beliefs, albeit in the opposite direction of the Pharisees. There's more to our faith than just believing certain things. Instead, our goal is to have humble, teachable spirits, where we're always listening, where we're always attentive to where God may be moving in the world, and we're always open to the possibility that God is going to work in new ways and through the people that we least expect. Otherwise, like the Pharisees, we risk missing out on what God is doing right in front of us. So the people of God, we need to be humble, and we need to be open to the possibility that God is going to do new things in our lives. That is my hot take this morning. Just try to convince me otherwise.